Masechet Baba Batra, Daf Sadi Dalid. Hamocher perot lachavero hareze mekabel alav roba tinofet lese'ah. If someone sells produce to his friend, the buyer must accept upon himself the ratio of 1/4 of a kav of refuse within all that grain per se'ah. That would come out to 1 out of 24 parts. There are 6 kav in 1 se'ah, and this is a quarter kav, so 4 times 6 is 26. So in other words, if I'm buying some wheat from you, it's expected that there is going to be some bad wheat, some impurities. We're going to see exactly, does this mean bad wheat? Does it mean other food or just rocks and dirt? The Gemara will discuss. But that's the ratio. If it's more than 1 out of 24, then surely the buyer can complain. It says, what would you sell me? This has too much refuse in it. But what if it's less than 1 out of 24? Then that's the expected. That's just what happens in normal processing and gathering of the wheat, that there's going to be 1/24. The Gemara will discuss what if it's exactly 1 out of 24. Next case, Te'eni mekabel alav ayeser meturaot leme'ah. If someone sells figs to someone else, then the buyer must expect and accept 10 infested figs, wormy figs, per 100. So 10% is going to be bad quality. Maybe worse than bad quality, actually spoiled. Martef shel yayin mekabel alav 10 kosesot leme'ah. If someone sells a cellar of barrels of wine, lots of barrels of wine there, then they have to expect that 10 out of 100 barrels may be sour wine. And the buyer can't complain and says, oh, look, there's 8 barrels of sour wine here. No, if it's 11, then he can complain and says, this is too much sour wine. But 10 or below, that's part of the sale, it's part of the expectation that the buyer knows, and therefore, even though he's paying for 100, he forgives that 10 because that's just what usually happens. Kankanim besharon mekabel alav 10 pitasot leme'ah. If someone sells jugs of wine in the Sharon region, known for a certain type of jug, he accepts upon himself 10 inferior quality jugs. This word pitasot probably comes from the Greek pithos jar, which was a very large jar, and here is a picture of one of them. So out of every 100 jars, 10 are going to be bad quality jars. They're not made in factory machines. They're made by hand, and so that is the normal expectation, and the buyer cannot complain and get his money back for them. Gemara, Tane Rav Katina, Rova Kitnit Lese'ah. Rav Katina has a braita that's a little bit different from our Mishnah. Our Mishnah says, Roba Tinofet. Tinofet sounds like dirt. But here it says that someone who buys a se'ah of grain has to accept a quarter kav of kitnit, of legumes. So this is different because according to this, legumes mixed into the grain are acceptable, but not refuse, meaning dirt or rocks. Legumes can get mixed in because during the processing and during the storage, there are legumes around and there is wheat around, and they can one can get mixed into the other. A little bit, shouldn't be too much, but there might be some differences, some impurities. And so according to this braita, legumes mixed into the wheat is permitted. So we ask, Vafrurit la, so does this imply that dirt is no good? V'ha'amar Rabba bar Chiya ketos fa'a mishmed Rabba, borer seror migorno shel chabero, noten lo deme chitin. We have a statement by Rabba, the son of Chiya, from his last name, ketos fa'a, in the name of Rabba, that let's say someone has a storehouse of grain, and then his friend comes and picks out some pebbles from that storehouse, or on the threshing floor here where he has all of his grain. Someone else comes and picks out the pebbles. You think he's doing him a favor, but not true. That friend has to pay him the value of wheat according to the volume of the pebbles that he took out. If he took out a gallon worth of pebbles, he has to pay him the value of a gallon of wheat. Why would that be so? Because the owner of that wheat would have been able to sell all of it at a market price of wheat, including with the pebbles in it. Now it takes the pebbles out, so you can't go and put pebbles in on purpose. You're not allowed to purposely put impurities into the grain. And so if the friend had not taken any out, he would have sold this entire thing, including the pebbles, for the price of that, whatever, a kav of wheat, however much he's selling. Now that the friend took out the pebbles, he has that much less in volume. So the friend has to pay him back for the value of wheat of that volume that he took out. What do we see from here? We see that if there is a volume of wheat with some pebbles mixed in, that's included in the sale. In other words, the friend never came, then it would be acceptable not to have too much, but to have some pebbles in, and it's sold with the pebbles. And so now we have a contradiction between this Baraita Rav Katina that says only legumes are acceptable in a mixture of grain, but not dirt and pebbles. But then we have this statement in the name of Rabbah that sounds like pebbles and dirt would be acceptable if they're a small part of the mixture. So can we reconcile these two? And the answer is yes. Kitnit roba, afrurit pachot miroba. If it's legumes that are mixed in, then you're allowed to have up to and exactly a quarter of a kav. More than a kav would not be acceptable, but a kav itself and below is acceptable. However, when it comes to dirt and pebbles, then it has to be lower than a kav. That's the difference between them, and that would make sense because here it says rova kitnit lase'ah, so exactly a rova would be permitted. If it's legumes. Whereas Rabbah was talking about if someone took some pebbles, it doesn't say exactly how much, but the point is that this would be less than a rova, but an exact rova, not good. So pebbles are a little bit less acceptable than legumes. Good. Now we ask, Vafrurit roba la. Now is this true that exactly one rova of dirt is not acceptable? V'hatanya. Now we have yet another baraita. המוכר פירות לחברו חיטין מקבל עליו רובע קטנית לסאה. שעורי מקבל עליו רובע נישובת לסאה. עדשים מקבל עליו רובע אפרורית לסאה. This baraita teaches us that if someone sells produce to his friend, so it depends what it is. If it's wheat, then the buyer accepts upon himself a quarter kav of legumes per se'ah as impurities. This language of this baraita is almost exactly the same as Rav Katina's baraita. Rav Katina himself was explaining our Mishnah. Our Mishnah actually used a different word for the mixture, tinofit, which means impurity. That word is kind of ambiguous. Impurity of what? And so Rav Katina was coming to explain it. And this baraita also is saying that the acceptable thing that's in a mixture of wheat is legumes. So what does that mean? Does that mean legumes and not dirt? Okay, that's what we're trying to explore. Okay, anyway, this statement says legumes equals one rova, that's okay. More than that is no good. If the seller is selling barley, then the buyer accepts upon himself one rova of chaff within every se'ah of barley. He's separating the chaff from the grains of the barley and throws it up in the air, and hopefully the wind takes away the chaff, but inevitably some chaff will be left behind. And this is an acceptable ratio. And adashim, if one is selling lentils, then the buyer accepts upon himself dirt that is up to or equal to one rova mixed into the lentils. Okay, so we have three things here. Interestingly, for the lentils, it mentions dirt, but for the wheat, it only mentions that there could be legumes inside. So how are we to understand this? What about dirt if it's inside wheat? Would that be the same as if you find legumes in it, or does legumes mean precisely legumes but not dirt? So first we ask, my love, is it not the case that it doesn't matter what is being mixed in. Maybe the Braita is just giving things that usually get mixed in. What usually gets mixed into wheat? Usually it's legumes. What usually gets mixed into barley? Usually it's a chaff. And usually dirt gets mixed into lentils. But really it doesn't matter what it is, what the impurity is. And isn't it true that it would be the same if dirt fell into wheat, that it would also be acceptable up to and equal to a rova. And that would challenge the distinction we made here before, that equal to a rova is permitted if legumes are mixed into the wheat, but not with dirt. So that's the question. And the answer is, Shane adashim demiakad akri lehu. No, lentils are different from wheat because lentils are dug up from the ground, and therefore when you're harvesting them, it's very likely that some dirt will get mixed into the lentils, and that is acceptable. However, grain, where you're cutting it with a sickle, not digging it up out of the dirt, that much dirt would not be acceptable. And so this baraita is being precise that if it's equal to a kav in the wheat, legumes are okay. But if it's dirt, then it has to be less than a rova regarding the wheat. There's a higher expectation regarding lentils that there will be some more dirt left in there. Okay, so now we turn this question the opposite way as a proof. אלא תעמד העדשים דמיעקד אקרי להו, אבל חיטה וסערה לה. תפשוט מינה חיטה וסערה דאפרורית לה מקבל. Okay, now that we understand that the reason regarding lentils that you're allowed to have a mixture of dirt in there up to or equal one rova, and the reason is because those are uprooted out of the ground. Okay, so since that's the reason, then we can infer that regarding wheat and barley, it's not acceptable to have a rova. So can we learn from here that when it comes to wheat and barley, a mixture of dirt is one would not accept if it was equal to a rova, and that would actually prove the distinction that we made earlier. And we answer no, it's not necessarily a proof. Leolam chite usare mekabel afrurit adashim isterichale. If we only had this baraita, we could conclude that for wheat and barley, one would in fact also accept dirt. Nevertheless, we have to mention regarding lentils specifically that dirt is permitted at one rova. Why? Because I might have thought that since lentils are dug up out of the ground, the buyer would have to accept even more than a rova. And so this baraita comes to teach us, listen, even for dirt, which you expect to find within lentils, more than a rova is no good, has to be a rova exactly or less. So this baraita cannot teach us one way or another, but this distinction stands, the difference between a mixture in wheat. If it's legumes, it can be up to or equal to a rova, but if it's dirt and pebbles, then it has to be less than a rova. Next, we have a very interesting halacha, Amar Rav Huna. Im ba lenapot menape et kulo. Amri la dina v'amri la kenasa. Rav Huna teaches that if the buyer decides that he's going to sift through the entire amount of wheat, looking for impurities, he's suspicious for whatever reason, and he wants to sit there and sift through it, if he finds that, in fact, there is more than a rova of a kav of impurities, then he's allowed to take out all of the impurities and go to the seller and say, you have to take back all these impurities and pay me for that volume or give me more wheat to make up for it. So if he finds that it's less than a rova, then he has to accept it because that was the teaching of the Mishnah. But if it's more than that, not only does he have to demand payback for the amount above a rova, he can get paid back for the entire amount, which is very interesting. Once it triggers the rova, the amount more than the rova, then he gets paid for everything. Now, there's two interpretations of Rav Huna. Some say that it's a strict law, and some say it's a penalty. If you say it's a law, it means that he has a rightful claim to all of that refuse. Whereas if you say it's a kanas, it means he doesn't have a rightful claim, but because the seller seems to have done something wrong, we give an extra penalty. Well, let's explain both sides. Amri la dina, man tehiv zuzeh apere shapire yahib, veroba la tarach inish, yotem verova tarach inish, vechavan de tarach bechule. If you say that Rav Huna is telling us the letter of the law, then that would mean that someone who pays money for wheat or whatever he's buying, he is paying for good wheat. He deserves to get high quality wheat, a whole se'ah of that. Now, if the impurities are a rova or less, then a person generally is not going to take the trouble. It takes a long time to go and sift through it, right? Think about people who sift through rice before Pesach. It's a lot of trouble. So if it's only a little bit, then people just waive their right to it. But once it's more than a rova, so that person is going to sit and take the trouble, however many hours it takes, they're going to go through the trouble. Once they go through the trouble, well, then they sift all of it. So then he deserves to get what he paid for. So in other words, from the letter of the law, he deserves to get a full se'ah of good wheat. And generally, the only reason he forgives the amount of impurity is because it's a little bit, and it's not worth the trouble to take it out. But if he does go through the trouble to take it out, then he deserves to take the full amount of what's missing. However, v'amri la kenasa roba shechiach yoter lo shechiach v'hu de'ariv v'chavan de'ariv kenasu rabanan bechule. And others say that it's normal, it's usual to have a quarter kav of impurity. More than that is unusual. So if you find more than a quarter kav, then it's more than likely that the seller actually mixed in deceitfully added impurities. And so because he seems to have added more impurity than is the normal amount, the rabbis say you did that, you tried to trick the seller, you tried to trick the buyer, you know what? Now you are going to lose all of the impurities, that even the ones that naturally are in there in a normal usage, in a normal mixture, even that you will have to pay for. Okay, so that's the difference between the two. So there's a theoretical difference in how you think of it, right? Are those impurities, according to the Kanas one, you'd say, listen, when you pay money, you're paying money for wheat with some impurities because that's just normal. And so really the buyer doesn't have a right to whatever impurities are naturally in the wheat according to the normal process. The buyer does not have a right to that. But if the seller adds more, then the seller has to lose out on all the amount of the volume of those impurities. Whereas if you say it's from the letter of the law, then really the buyer has a right to 100% of good produce, and just generally he's not going to bother to sift through it. But if he does bother to sift through it, and he has a reason to do so, and it turns out really there is more than that amount, then he actually deserves from the letter of the law to take the full amount. All right, what would be a practical difference between them? There's many different opinions about the practical difference. You can read the note here. One of them is how we will apply this law to other similar laws, and that's what we're going to do right now. We're going to challenge Rav Huna from a number of different cases, and some of them will be an outright challenge to Rav Huna totally, and some of them will be a challenge to the reading that it's a din or the reading that it's a kanas, that it's a penalty. So we have a few cases, and to remember them, we have a mnemonic device, siman. Kol teresh tareh de Rabin bar Rav Nachman ona'a vekabelanuta. Me'eti be. The first one is from a Mishnah in Kilayim. Kol se'ah sheyesh ba roba mimin acher yema'et. The Mishnah teaches that if I have a lot of seeds, now, I'm not allowed to plant mixed seeds from different species. So let's say I have a se'ah, and mostly it's of species A, but there's a little bit of species B. So how much is okay? If it's just a little bit, it's okay. I could just plant the whole thing, and we don't worry about that little amount. But if there is a rova per se'ah of the other species, then I have to reduce it. I have to go and take some out. It doesn't say I have to take all of it out, but I have to reduce it somewhat. Okay, let's analyze this Mishnah. Savru de roba de kilayim ki yoter meroba de hacha vekatane yemaet. Right now, let's assume that an exact rova of kilayim is prohibited, just like regarding a sale, more than a rova is prohibited. So when it comes to a sale, exactly a rova is okay. But here, this says exactly one rova, and yet it says you have to take it down. So let's assume for the moment that when it comes to kilayim, an exact rova is prohibited, just like when it comes to a sale, more than a rova is prohibited, and he would have to pay. Now, yet this says that you have to take it down. So it's prohibited, and you have to reduce it. But it doesn't say that he has to take all of it out, even though the amount in there is a prohibited amount. It doesn't say you have to take out all of it. And there's a challenge to Rav Huna, because Rav Huna says once it surpasses the prohibited mark, and it's in a ratio that's prohibited, then you have to take out all of it. The seller has to pay for all of the refuse. But here it just says, even though it triggered the prohibited mark at one rova, nevertheless, okay, just take it down a little, and then you're okay. You don't have to take it all out. According to Rav Huna, you should have to take it all out. And we answer, la. Roba de kilayim ki roba de hachadame. No, the exactly a rova is the same in both cases. Just like here regarding selling, exactly one rova of refuse is permitted. So too, regarding kilayim, exactly one rova of the other type of seed is actually permitted. So it never passed the prohibited mark. If it did pass the prohibited mark, then you'd have to take it all the way down to 0, as Rav Huna says. But there's a case where it was just below, and it was still in a permitted ratio. Ihachi amayemaet. We ask about that. If so, why do you have to take it down? It's a permitted amount. A rova is permitted. So why do I have to take out some of it? Mishum chumra de kilayim, because kilayim is a very strict law, and so we want to make sure that you're not going to surpass. The rabbis make extra gederot. We're going to make a fence, and we're not going to let you have exactly amount because it's too close for comfort, and therefore take it down a little. Okay, ihachi emasefa Rabbi Yosef omer yavor. If we assume that, how will you explain the continuation of the Mishnah, where Rabbi Yosef says you have to pick out all of the seeds? If you have a rova there, then you have to take out all of it. Now, iyamat bishlama kiyoter meroba tinofet dame beha kami palge tanas kama sabar la kansinan netera atu isura v'Rabbi Yosef sabar kansinan. So, if you say that regarding kilayim, exactly a rova is a prohibited amount, and it's like more than more than a rova when it comes to a sale. Then this entire Mishnah makes sense, and the machloket is as follows: the Tanakama says that we do not make a penalty of what's permitted to what is prohibited. We don't make such penalties. We're going to follow here in the Rav Huna's statement, the opinion that says this is a penalty, and Tanakama would disagree with that and say, no, we don't make such penalties, and so if it's a rova, which is prohibited, take it down a little, and then you're okay. You don't make a penalty, you have to take out everything. Whereas Rabbi Yosef says, we do have such a penalty. Like Rav Huna also says that, you went up, you have a mixture, you obviously weren't very careful that you put a mixture of this other seed, and it's a rova, or more, which a rova itself is prohibited. Now you have a penalty, you have to take all of it out. So that would make sense. We can explain the Rabbi Yosef if exactly a rova is prohibited. Ela iyamat kerova dame amayavor. But if exactly a rova is permitted regarding kilayim, just like it is regarding a sale, then why do you have to take it out? According to the Rabbi Yosef, a rova is a permitted amount, so why do I have to take it all out? It's a permitted thing. I understand why you might have to lessen it a little bit, as we said, because you don't want to come too close. So therefore, the rabbis say, okay, lessen a little bit. But he didn't do anything wrong. It's still a permitted amount. Why would the Rabbi Yosef say that you have to take it out altogether? And the answer is hatam hainu tamat Rabbi Yosef. Mishum demechzeh ki mekayem kilayim. In the case of kilayim, the reason of Rabbi Yosef is because there it looks like one is allowing allowing oneself to plant kilayim. Now, even though, it's a rova exactly, but anybody looking is going to say, oh, look at that, there's some mixed seed in there, and may not know precisely that it's one rova. And so therefore, it's going to look like he allowed one rova, and maybe it'll even look like he added it, mekayem, that he did it on purpose, and he intentionally mixed it in so that he could plant it in. So if it's exactly a rova, it's too close, and it actually looks like he added it and put it there on purpose. And so therefore, you have to take it out all together, right? Once you have that amount there, an amount that looks like you put it in on purpose, you have to take it out all together so that no one will suspect or get any wrong ideas. But if in the beginning there's just a little bit, okay, that's normal, that there's just a tiny bit in there, and then the Bioseh would say to leave it, whereas Tanakama would say, listen, it's too close, so just reduce it, and we're not going to make you take everything out altogether. Okay, so we were able to defend Rav Huna, both opinions of Rav Huna, both interpretations of Rav Huna from this Mishnah in Kilayim. We now have yet another challenge against Rav Huna. Tashema, Shenaim shehifkidu esel echad, ze maneh veze matayim, ze omer matayim sheli, veze omer matayim sheli, noten laze maneh velaze maneh, v'asha'ar yehe munach ad sheyavo Eliyahu. We've seen this case back in Baba Metzia. It's a Mishnah. Two people deposited money with a certain watchman. One of them deposited 100 dinar and the other deposited 200 dinar. After some time, they both come to take back their money, and they both say, I'm the one that gave you 200. Now, obviously, one of them is lying, but one of them is telling the truth. So what do? How can we adjudicate this case? According to Tanakama, the watchman should give both of them 100, because surely they're both owed 100. That everybody would agree to. And then the rest, the other 100 that the watchman has, he keeps and let it lie there until Eliyahu Hanavi comes and will tell us who the rightful owner is. So it makes sense to do that. Why should the watchman keep all of it? For sure, they both have a right to the 100. Okay, what do we see from here? We see that even though one of these people is for sure lying, we do not penalize him, right? We say, listen, you're owed 100, even though you're lying. Well, one of you is lying, but nevertheless, you claim 100. That claim is true. We'll give you your 100. We do not penalize the person to say, since you're lying about 100, therefore you get nothing. We don't say that. So we see from here that we do not apply the idea of penalties. This is a challenge to Rav Huna, according to the opinion that explains Rav Huna that that's a penalty, that if once someone has more than a quarter kav of impurity, then he has to reduce it altogether. The seller has to pay for all of it. Over here, you don't make a penalty, so therefore it makes sense that in the case of the impurities, also one would not make a penalty. So this is a challenge against that interpretation of Rav Huna. And we answer, Hachi ashta, wait, the two cases are not the same. Hatam vaday mane lemor umane lemor. Hacha miyemar delav kule arube arib. In that case of the two people making a deposit, they for sure each are owed 100. In other words, they're not total liars. They have some claim. So we're not going to make a penalty because they have for sure some rightful claim. So let them get at least that amount. However, in the case of the seller who has impurities in his wheat, he might be a total fraud. It could be that originally there was no impurities and he intentionally added all of the impurities into that amount. And so really, he doesn't deserve to be able to forego any of the impurities at all. That's why, in the case of impurities, we do make a penalty. And so this can answer that interpretation of Rav Huna. When someone is for sure telling somewhat of the truth, then we're not going to make a penalty. But if there's a possibility that they have no truth whatsoever, and it could be that they really do have to pay the entire thing, then we're going to make them pay the entire thing. It's not fair in the case of the two depositors to give them nothing at all because, they both deserve at least 100. So you have to do that. And then the rest of it, then you can withhold that. But in the case of the seller, it could be that he actually has to pay all of it because maybe all of the impurity he put in on purpose. So there, it's appropriate to apply such a penalty. Next question. Tashema misefa. Amar Rabbi Yosef. Imken ma'ifsid haramai. Ela kol yemunach ad sheyebo Eliyahu. In that same case, Rabbi Yosef disagrees, and he says, if you give both of the depositors 100 each, then the swindler doesn't lose anything. He has no incentive to tell the truth. He says, I may as well lie because at maximum, they'll believe me and I'll get the 200. And minimum, even if they don't believe me, I'm still getting the 100. I don't lose anything. I'm getting the 100 I deposited. And so the other 100 that is being withheld, well, that's withheld from the other guy. He has no loss and no incentive. So rather, according to the Biyoseh, the watchman should hold all of it. All 300 should be put aside in a safe place until Eliyahu comes. And that way, the swindler will say, oh, look, now I have 0. See, I'm trying to lie and get 200, and now I don't even get my 100 back. So that will incentivize him to admit, you know what, I changed my mind. Just give me the 100 and it's okay. That was the Biyoseh's opinion. So we see, according to the Biyoseh, we do make a penalty when someone is making some kind of false claim. So we say, you know what, not only do you not get the extra amount that you're claiming, you get nothing at all, even the part that you definitely deserve. So we see the Biyoseh does make such penalties, and this would support the penalty option of Rav Huna, and it could be a challenge to the other interpretation of Rav Huna, who says that it's from the letter of the law. So a letter of the law would say, well, maybe you don't make a penalty, but this would say you do make a penalty. So this seems to be a support for the opinion that says Rav Huna is based on a penalty. Then we say not necessarily, it's not a proof for that option. Hatam vadai ikaramai. Hacha miyema da'aruve ariv. In the case of the two people depositing, at least one of them is for sure a swindler, and therefore it makes sense to penalize both of them in order to fish out the one who is a swindler, because definitely one of them is a swindler. However, in the case of selling impure produce, who says that he mixed in anything at all? Maybe just naturally through the processing, it happened that a lot of legumes fell into this mixture of wheat, and it could happen. It could be that he didn't put it in intentionally, but it just happened, and therefore it would not be appropriate to penalize the seller. And so it's not necessarily a proof that for sure we penalize people in such a situation. So there's no proof from here for the interpretation of Rav Huna that it's a penalty. Ta'ashema, shetar sheyesh bo ribit, konsin oto, ve'eno gobe lo et hakeren ve'lo et haribit, dibre Rabbi Meir. If two people, someone lends money to the other, and they write a contract, and they write interest, says when you pay me back, I'm lending you $100, you have to pay me back $120, and they write it into the contract. So according to Rabbi Meir, we make a penalty. Not only can the lender not collect interest, that for sure is not allowed, that's in the Torah, that's the basic law. Not only that, he cannot even collect the principal. He can't collect anything at all. You tried to take interest and you wrote that in a contract. Now you cannot collect any money at all. You lose even the 100 that you first lent out. So we see from here that we do apply a penalty. When someone does something wrong, they lose out not only the wrong thing, but they lose out on the entire amount. This would be a support for the interpretation of Rav Huna that says it's a penalty. So is this a good support for that opinion? And it would be a challenge to the other opinion that says, no, it's not a penalty. Hachi hashta hata mishat kitiba hu da'abad le shuma. Hacha miyema da'arube arib. Can you compare these cases? In the case of a loan, from the moment that the lender writes the contract, he already is collecting interest. Even before he takes any money, even before he takes $1, at the time he already is transgressing. So we know that the lender is a sinner just for writing the contract, and therefore it's surely appropriate to penalize him and say, now you get nothing. But in the case of the seller, who said that he mixed in anything at all? It's true, there's a large amount of impurity here, and it seems problematic, but it's not necessarily true that the seller is a sinner and he mixed it in on purpose. Could be that in this batch, during the processing, just by itself, by mistake, a lot of impurity went in. And so therefore, you can argue that it's appropriate to penalize someone in the case of a loan, as Rabbi Meir says, but not necessarily would you penalize the person in the case of a seller. So this is not a proof for the opinion that Rav Huna made his law as a penalty. Now we ask one last question for today. Tashemat misefa. Hachamim omerim goveh et hakeren veno goveh et haribit. The continuation of that very source says that Chachamim disagree and says that if the lender, even though he wrote a document and included interest in the document, nevertheless he can collect back the principal. He just obviously cannot collect back the interest. So we see that according to Chachamim, we do not make such penalties, and therefore it makes sense that in Rav Huna's case also of the seller of grain, we should not make a penalty. This would be a challenge according to the opinion that explains Rav Huna as a penalty. And we answer here also, Hachi ashta, are these comparable? Hatam vadai karna deheterahu, hacha miyema dekule ra la arube arib. In the case of a loan, for sure the principal was permitted. He was permitted to lend him 100, and so he's permitted to take back 100, so that's why there's no penalty in this case. However, in the case of the sale, it's possible that the entire amount was added in by the seller, and originally there were no impurities. He added all the impurities, so therefore it's appropriate to make a penalty. Notice you should only make a penalty that he gets nothing if it's possible that he actually deserves nothing. But in the case of a loan, he surely deserves his principal back. That was not stolen property, so you're not going to make a penalty if for sure he deserves to get the 100 back. But if there's a possibility that all of the admixture was put in by him and he really has to pay for all of it, well then we do make a penalty. When there's way too much, then we make a penalty that he has to pay for all of it. Baruch Adonai Le'olam, Amen ve'amen.